Let's get started. Welcome. So great to see this room now filled with actual real faces. It's really a relief actually to be talking to real people rather than to black screens on Zoom and talking to the black hole of the internet. Welcome everyone. If you can put up my presentation there. Then, no, you're not there. That goes too quickly. So while you put up my presentation, my name is Bas van Ruiven. I'm co-chair of Iconics together with Chris Ebai, who I haven't seen there. We try to shepherd a little bit the scenarios process along the development of socioeconomic scenarios. And I'm also work here at IIASA and lead the Sustainable Surface Systems Research Group in the Energy, Climate and Environment program. And I'll be hosting you for the next 3 days here for the second Scenarios Forum, the second forum on societal and climate scenarios. Yeah, so we're really proud to organize this together with 3 great sponsors actually, with IIASA, ClimateWorks and the Engage project, and with many partners, as you see here, with the IMC together, IPCC, the WCRP, and Future Earth System Governance. Who are we as a... Can someone click so that this clicker works? Thank you. So who are we as a community 3 years on after the first Scenarios Forum in Denver? We have grown a bit. We are now at more than 500 registered participants for this meeting. About 300 of you are here in this room, or at least here during the next 3 days. And about 200 are with us online. Our gender balance is around 40-60. That could have been better, but I think actually for scientific environments it's not the worst that we've seen. And covering our geographies, 28 countries, people are here, 33 online. We cover all of the continents, but in the end, 3/4 of the participants in the end are from North America or Europe. We have organized this meeting with a relatively large steering committee. Maybe all of the steering committee members can actually briefly stand up to show yourself and identify who you are. It's a very large group because we are covering a lot of disciplinary ground in this meeting. The communities bringing together and working with climate and sustainability scenarios are very broad, so we wanted people on board from many different backgrounds. And unfortunately, not everyone can be here. So Jana and Ramon could not make it in the first place due to conflicts. But also we have some rather badly and sadly timed COVID cases. So among others, Brian O'Neill, the organizer of the first Scenarios Forum in Denver 3 years ago, tested positive and could not travel. And is not with us the next 3 days, but tries to be with us online as much as he can. The same holds for Elmar Kriekler here in your lower left corner, who is still waiting to test negative and then join us as soon as he can. So we are here. Where are we in this Luxembourg Conference Center, the old summer palace of the Emperor of Austria? We will be here for the next 3 days, sometimes in this plenary room, the Theatersaal as it's called in German. And and many of the parallel sessions will take place in this venue here as well, in all of the colored rooms that you see here, and follow the signage to where the rooms where you want to be. Next to the 5 rooms that are here, we also have 2 rooms over in the main IIASA building. And for those, you basically go out in the front where you entered with going in with the shuttle buses, and you follow the signs around the corner to the main entrance of IIASA, and there you enter and go to the first floor, European first floor for the Americans, so you need to get up a stairs to get to the first floor. And there are two other rooms, Bodek and Krishani, where we will have more meetings. What will the next 3 days look like? We will start here this morning in this plenary room, and then we will have a long lunch. We have budgeted a lot of time for social time because many of us, basically all of us I guess, have not really seen each other for quite a long time, and we thought people want to catch up and really meet each other in person again. So we have 2-hour lunch breaks at the middle of the day here in the conference center. Then we'll break for parallel sessions, partly here, partly in IIASA, and tonight there will be a reception and poster session. Tomorrow we will again start here in this room with plenary presentations, and then break for the rest of the day into parallel sessions and have a dinner here outside behind the conference center at the end of the day. And then on Wednesday we have another full day, starting directly with plenary sessions in the morning and coming back here in the afternoon to close the meeting. And we go all the way till 6 on Wednesday, so I hope that many of you can actually still be there and you have not arranged your flights such that you need to leave before we end. A few housekeeping topics. We started with a few, now there's actually a bit more. If you need anything, the conference headquarters are at the end, at the end of this hallway where you had your coffee, basically this morning, for those who had. If you enter that at the end, you go a little bit further straight, there's the Maria Theresia room, there you find the organizing staff if you need anything. Shuttle pickups are in principle in front of the conference center where they dropped you off as well today. And if you need to go to the airport after the meeting on Wednesday, and you want to have taxis arranged, then please, or the shuttle bus for that matter, make yourself known before the end of today, because those logistics will be arranged at the end of today. So before 5:30 today, fill out the form that you have been emailed to where you want to go after this meeting. COVID, of course, is still among us, as we have seen. We have some schedules in the schedule shifts in the plenary program. It's more among us than I had hoped originally for a summertime conference. And so if you have symptoms, you want to be tested, you can test yourself here. There are tests in the pharmacy, Apotheke in German, opposite to the IIASA Schloss building on the main square. If you're in the and otherwise inquire with your hotels for testing, but also it's fully accepted, as actually many of you here wear masks and take your own measures. You don't want to be in your hotel room 5 days after this meeting because you tested positive. We already did that in Denver because there was so much snow. And so don't do that here because you have COVID. It's less fun. For the parallel sessions, for those organizing those sessions, there are AV persons in each room. There's Synergies Forum staff in each room to help you out. If you want to get around, follow the signs. In principle, there should be signs to everywhere, and if you don't have those, also let us know. Coffee breaks will be here in the foyer or in IIASA, and also on the back terrace to spread people out a little bit, because it's very warm, and don't stand too close to each other, especially because COVID is still among us. Lunch breaks will be here in the oval room in the conference center. Follow the signs, follow the crowd. Dinner tomorrow night has vegan and vegetarian options as we have today, and it will be also outside here. And if you need a lactation room, just inquire with the staff in the Maria Theresia room. We are doing this meeting hybrid. So as I mentioned, there's about 200 people following us online, which means that we should connect with those outside of this venue through IIASA Connect. Questions can be asked. If you go in IIASA Connect, you go to Groups, Scenarios Forum, there is the program. If you go to the Program tab, under the program you have links for every individual session. If you click on that, every session has at the bottom a comment box. That's where you can ask your questions. And that's what will be monitored for questions coming in. Download the IIASA Connect app. It makes your life easier if you're going around here. And if you are here, please don't watch the live streams of other rooms that you're not in, because we don't want to break the internet here in this venue. There's enough bandwidth that needs to go out for all of the streaming. And do use good housekeeping with microphones during your discussions in these hybrid meetings, because otherwise the people outside the venue cannot hear what you are doing. A last bit on media and social media. We want this meeting to be a free and open presentation and discussion of preliminary results, sometimes published results. And so please don't record, post, or quote literally slides without permission from the speakers before you put those out to the outside world. Inquire with that. That also holds for the online participants. If you make screenshots and put them out in the world, please ask the speaker first before you do so. Some of the parallel sessions will run under Chatham House rules, and that will be announced at the beginning of those sessions so that that's clear. But of course, right, any media around, any interviews, outside sessions are definitely fine, and tweeting, social media about the meeting in general, please do so. And if you are on Twitter, use the hashtag Scenarios Forum without a number, just hashtag Scenarios Forum. We recycle that for the whole series. And you can tag at Iconics SSP so that we can retweet your activities there, and also follow Iconics SSP. That's it for opening housekeeping. Let's move to some of the welcoming talks. So can I ask and invite Albert, Chris, Keelan, and Jim to take place here on in the panel. Yeah, then, am I on? Can you hear me? Okay. Yeah, then we will first start with an opening welcome by Albert van Jaarsveld, who is the Director General of the International Institute of Applied Systems Analysis, IIASA, since 2018, and who has a background in zoology and biodiversity research, also one of the communities we have represented here.
Thank you, Bas. And from my side, a warm welcome to all of you. I'm sorry about the warm weather, but we only can control so many things in our daily lives. But I'm really pleased and delighted to see that so many people have traveled so far to join us for this particular meeting. You know it's becoming a very important meeting, and it's becoming a pace-setting meeting in terms of what's required as far as climate change action is concerned. We're meeting today in what we consider to be a very historic site here in Luxembourg. You're in the summer palace, as you heard earlier, of the Habsburg dynasty. Unlike the Trump dynasty, the Habsburg dynasty, the facilities are all paid up, so we don't owe anybody any money. But I think it's wonderful that we have the opportunity to get together and spend some time in these historic buildings, and I hope you'll have a little bit of time to walk around and read a little bit up about what's happened here. We're also celebrating this year the 50th anniversary of IIASA. We have been in this particular facility for most of those years, except in the beginning, and we are here, of course, at the courtesy of the Austrian government that has housed IIASA for the entire duration of the existence of the institution. So we're really very grateful for the Austrian government for bringing us together here again today. But let me just say that this Scenarios Forum is part of what we do at IIASA. IIASA is known as an institution, besides the research that we're involved with, for bringing communities together, and for bringing communities together around key topics that are important for the global community. And I think this Scenarios Forum is a very good example of that kind of activity. So we are really, as an institution, proud of our legacy over the last 50 years in terms of bringing communities together, but also in terms of the ongoing work that we've carried out on behalf of the global research community in supporting institutions and bodies like the IPCC, IPBES, etc., as an institution. I think it's one of the legacy contributions that IIASA has made over the past few years. So from my side, I'm going to end off and simply say welcome to Luxembourg. I hope you will enjoy your time here. Use your time to catch up with old friends and colleagues. And I hope you'll remember us and come and visit us again very soon if you get the opportunity. And I wish you all fruitful deliberations over the next couple of days. Thank you, Bas. Okay.
Thank you. Then we have Chris Ebai, the co-chair of ICONICS, professor of global health and environment at the University of Washington as well.
Thank you very much, Bas, and really want to thank you and all the organizing committee for all the work that's gone into this. This is a really gratifying meeting to be at. Some of you in the room were at some of the very first organizing sessions for the shared socioeconomic pathways. I don't think we really could have envisioned how this has taken off and the value that it has provided for the IPCC and a whole range of other assessments. So we're absolutely delighted to see all of you here. I'm also giving a welcome on behalf of Future Earth, one of the co-organizers of this. And I wanted to add a little bit to what Bas said about the weather. One of the very first gatherings around moving forward on the SSPs was in Washington, D.C. during Snowmageddon, where people got stuck in Washington, D.C. for days. The first official scenarios forum was in Denver. Kwan spent his birthday there because, again, people couldn't get out. Couldn't organize a big snowstorm here this time, so we've got a nice heat wave for you. Just to remind you as we look into the future how uncertain it is and how we need to think about all of the variabilities around that future. And that, of course, is the power of using the RCPs and SSPs, all the research that you've been doing to try and lay out what the range of possible futures could be. I really look forward to hearing all of your presentations, all the engagements over the next few days. So welcome.
Thank you. And then we have a welcome from Kewan Riahi, who is director of the Energy, Climate and Environment Program at IIASA and also co-chair of the IMC working group on scenarios. And host of the Scenarios Working Group, a workshop that took place here in this venue in 2015.
Yeah, thank you, Bas. Yeah, big welcome also from my side. It's really exciting that we have this meeting, and thank you that you all came despite the COVID crisis. It's for me quite an emotional moment to see so many people in this room after 2.5 years of basically having this room almost empty. So that's and the scenario forum is even making it more exciting. Yeah, so perhaps let me comment on the timing of the workshop. I think it's not only that it is after COVID, I think it's also for the scenario process. We are at a really critical crossing. We have I think gained a lot of experience with applying the SSPs, and there have been new concepts there, new suggestions where to go, new narratives, suggestions for updates, and also some critique about the feasibility and the plausibility of some of the scenarios, and we come here together to all discuss this and think about the new direction that we want to take with the scenarios in the community. And I think the other reason why this is a really important timing is that we are just ending the AR6 cycle. So, and the IPCC is already preparing for the next scenario cycle, the AR7. And I think it's very important that the community comes together like us this time here, and thinks about what could be the scientific input into the IPCC process from the scenario side, which have played an important integrating role in the IPCC traditionally. So thank you very much. I look very forward to the discussions and the many parallel sessions that we have. Thank you.
And then finally, Jim Skee, Professor of Sustainable Energy at the Imperial College of London and co-chair of Working Group 3 of the IPCC.
Yeah, okay, thank you, Baz. And I think I'm representing IPCC here, although there's no particular reason why it should be me, because we have co-chairs from all of the working groups here, Valerie Masson-Delmat and Hans Portner. So IPCC is a formal partner for the event, and in terms of IPCC language, we are co-sponsoring this event from the IPCC side. So I'd just like to add my welcome. Just to say, scenarios play an absolutely critical role for all of the working groups in IPCC, and indeed they're a key mechanism for getting the working groups to operate together. And this has probably been the most cooperative cycle ever for IPCC, and scenarios have played their role there. One thing I wanted to flag was the policy relevance side of it. There was an extraordinary amount of interest over the last 2 weeks at the intersessional session of the subsidiary bodies of the Framework Convention. Sorry for the long language there. A huge interest in scenarios in IPCC's work. And that really fed into two processes: the structured expert dialogue for the review of the long-term goal of the convention, and again, apologies for the jargon, the technical dialogue for the global stocktake, for the first global stocktake from the Paris Agreement. And several of the people, I think, in this room were engaged in presenting IPCC material, including K1 there. Now, just to say, as I'm sure Tim will come on to explain, IPCC doesn't produce its own scenarios. It has to rely on scenarios that are produced by the community. Though under a 2005 decision, it is empowered to facilitate the production of scenarios by the community. So this is an extremely important meeting for IPCC. IPCC will be having its own scenarios workshop before the end of the 6th cycle. And I think there's actually an excellent opportunity here to get a handover so that we have a smooth move over into AR7. Just before I conclude, I can tell you that the legal and administrative hurdles for getting partnership in this meeting through the IPCC bureaucracy was very considerable. And I think Baz's and my signatures are actually on it. But the hard work was done by Anna Parani, the head of the TSU of Working Group 1, and Pat Wagner here at IIASA. So a big thank you to them for pulling off that big task. And I personally am really looking forward to the scientific substance of this meeting, and would like to add to the welcome.
Thank you. Yeah, that is true. And given that bureaucracy, it's actually quite miraculous that the IPCC is able to pull off these enormous assessment reports every few years. Thank you for those welcomes. Let me then invite to the stage, if you would like to move back to your seats, then and then invite Carol Green from the University of Washington here to, if you want to stay, you can, but I think it's, it's much better visible from there. Yeah, so Carol is a climate change and health researcher working with Chris Ebai at the University of Washington, and currently working on her master's in public health and global health. And during the first Scenarios Forum, you have seen many presentations of how the literature was used up to the first Scenarios Forum. And we had collected that literature database, and Carol was the one actually at that time working with Brian O'Neill to implement that, and has been over the past few months definitely the driving force behind updating this work for the new iconic literature database for 2020 and 2021. And yeah, so that's what you'll present on now. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Thank you all. Thank you all, and thank you to Voss and to the steering committee. It's a real honor to be here. My name's Carol Green, and today I'll be presenting on the Iconics Literature Database of Shared Socioeconomic Pathways. And like Voss said, this is the second iteration, and so this is compiling literature from 2020 to 2021. The first version of this database was presented at the previous Scenarios Forum and was led by Brian O'Neill, and it's an honor to continue that work to include more recent publications. I think I have a clicker up here. Beautiful, okay. And it's a great joy to announce that as of about 4 days ago, the preliminary version of this SSP literature database has been released, and it is now up and running. This preliminary version includes 1,133 papers that use SSPs within their analysis. In total, there are about 1,500 papers, so this is the initial version, and it will be expanded upon later. The literature database captures publications that use SSPs, and then after they were captured, they were then tagged under various applications and categories and study types, some of which we will walk through today. And if you're interested in more details, I will be presenting some more of the methods in session 202. While this is really relevant for many reasons, including analysis, one of the reasons that it's relevant is just to look at the growing number of publications that use SSPs. From 2013, when there were 15 publications, to 2021, where we now have almost 1,000 publications. With this almost exponential growth of SSP publications, we can see the importance of updating the scenario framework and addressing some of the needs of the scenario framework, which is really relevant for this meeting, so it's exciting. We do see as well that there is a growing number of papers that just use one SSP instead of using multiple for comparison, which should be of note. Additionally, so in the last forum, afterwards, a publication was released by Brian O'Neill and many of the other steering committee authors here. And from this, we found several key framework needs, which are shown here. And we'll walk through these to sort of analyze what we're seeing from 2020 to 2021 in changes in those needs or how they've been addressed in recent years. This gives some good insights on what we are seeing in the publications. So to begin, one of the first key needs was looking at improved integration of societal and climate conditions. And here we have a slide showing the RCP and SSP pairings. And just to be very clear, this is only from 2020 to 2021. So this does not capture the previous SSP literature database. But these are important to highlight. Here we have a heat map showing some of the key pairings as well. So the darker pairings in blue are showing SSP and RCP pairings that are more common. And then we can see along the tier 1 scenario MIPS, we do have the darker yellow as well. And then lastly, just to highlight, the totals here, which are showing the total RCPs used and total SSPs used, these totals are not specifically for the SSPs used. These include ones that did not actually pair with any RCPs. And so you can, because of how this coding was organized, we don't have the numbers for the papers that didn't use any RCPs but are just SSPs. That will be updated in the final version. But for now, we can see some of those weightings as well. And then we can also see papers that did not use any RCPs as well and look at those pairings. And just to highlight this even a bit more, within the general setting, we have key SSPs that were used, and that goes from SSP2 being most used, then SSP5, followed by SSP1, 3, and then 4, lastly. And then this was followed by, we did group RCPs into low, moderate, and high, and then none as well. And you can see here the varying levels of what was used. Additionally, another key need was to improve the applicability at global to regional scales. And there's several ways at looking at that. There's another group that has looked at how regional narratives are being used. And so this doesn't dive as much into the regional extensions, but this gives us a glimpse of where SSPs are being used in the world and what analyses are being done. And here we can see that global is most used, followed by SSPs being used to analyze key things in Asia as well. And then on the side that is not being as used is small island developing states, where we see the least application of SSPs, followed by Australia and New Zealand, and then lastly Central and South America. This is really relevant because it does tie to regions where we see key vulnerabilities, where SSPs aren't being as used. Additionally, here we have improving the relevance beyond the climate research community. And this was another key need. Here we can look at the applications of SSPs. So within this literature database, we chose several key applications that we wanted to be highlighting based off of the literature and then based off of what we were seeing. And so here we have it starts with orange, where we have emissions and energy, orangish peachish, and then goes to yellow, where we see agriculture and land use. And in the middle of there is some ecosystems. And then finally, the gray blocks are looking at key economic sectors and looking at water supply and water hazards. And then finally, in blue, we see a lot more of the human impact side of things. And you can look more at the key there. The last one in purple is SDGs as well. Then here we do show when we include climate modeling as one of the key applications, it takes a big chunk of the applications. The reason why this is omitted on the first one is just because climate modeling was often paired with other applications. And so while it's still relevant to look at, oftentimes we'll see that papers that were focused on climate modeling or that category were then also focused on another category such as water hazards. Additionally, we see another key aim was intentionally aiming for policy applications. And here, in this version of the literature database, we coded the papers based off of the study type that they were. And so the publications range from adaptation studies to impact studies to policy papers. A keynote here is that assessment refers to when papers were assessing the scenario framework or when they were comparing significantly with SSPs in another analysis. And so here we see overwhelmingly that impact studies were the most used, which is followed by mitigation. And then similarly, we have assessment and adaptation, and then lastly was policy. And so this is of note just for going forward as well. And then there were several unaddressed recommendations. And so there are several things that need to be more expanded upon. However, there is some additional work being done from this literature database to take publications that did not use SSPs and specified why they did not use SSPs and look at why SSPs were not being used in the literature there. Some of the early findings from that are showing that there's some confusion around the scenario framework, there can be a lack of applicability to policy, and there's some misconceptions about SSPs. Therefore, it's really pivotal that as SSP literature increases, there's increased clarity around using the framework. It's a difficult aim to achieve both clarity and complexity, but I think it must be done for the continued use of SSPs. And this work is thanks to a lot of you who published significant work in SSPs, but it's also thanks to a great team of coders that we had from around the world. So I wanted to highlight them here, who worked with us and coded these papers and read hundreds, if not thousands of papers. So we're greatly indebted to their work as well. And then lastly, just a thank you to the other database authors, including the coders, Xiaoxi Jing, Tim Carter, Christy Ibai, Matthias Garshong, Casper Koch, Anna Leibson, Kayoshi Takahashi, and Basma Rubin, so many of the steering committee as well. And this project, as I said earlier, was originated by Brian O'Neill, who spearheaded the first version and completed and really encouraged this furthering of the second one as well. And we also had valuable contributions from Robert Chen, Vanessa Schweizer, Simona Ped, and Jan Petzold as well. And I'd like to say thank you to my sponsoring organizations, Clean Energy Institute and Center for Health and the Global Environment. And thank you all for listening.
Thank you. We would have time for one or two clarifying questions if there are any two. You might surprise a few people up there now. Yeah, Eric.
I had a quick question about the policy papers. I work for a Research for Policy Institute, and so sometimes you would publish an academic paper that is not focused on policy, and then separately a policy brief that refers to it. In that case, I would submit the academic paper to the database, to Iconics, but not. Should we do more of the submitting the policy briefs to the database?
Yeah, that's a really valuable insight. I do think that sometimes that can go missing because we don't include policy briefs if there is that academic literature published with it. And so it would be interesting to expand upon that further. But currently you're correct in that.
Thank you. And if you ask a question, please introduce yourself. I'm not sure how well the people online can actually see who you are. Volker.
Yeah, thanks a lot. Volker Krey from the IIASA ECE program. Very useful resource. I was just wondering, I mean, I've also been using it for teaching purposes on SSP RCP framework. Are there plans to make this a continuous activity I mean, which I understand is probably challenging, but maybe this would be a useful outcome in terms of updating this on a more regular basis.
Does this turn, oh no, it's on already. Thank you, Volker, that's an excellent question. As you can see, this was a massive amount of voluntary activity. Although some of the coders were supported by the teams from which they came. And it is a discussion we have to have. You saw the linear increase in the numbers of papers and trying to think about how to maintain this over time. Quickly becomes a question, I'm not sure what we're going to be able to do, but we would like to have that discussion across this meeting because it is an incredibly valuable resource. And really thank you again for all of the work that Carol and the team put in, and see if there's a way we can maintain it for at least a while until the numbers of papers are just impossible to handle.
It is wonderful to hear that you've been using it, so I'm glad.
Okay, thanks. Thanks, Carol.
There's one more question.
There's one more question? Oh, okay. Well then, sorry.
Yeah, good morning. Hou Miao-Du from Utrecht University, the Netherlands. I think today I might be the only lawyer attending this meeting. I'm wondering, in your literature review, has law or regulation been included in any way as a keyword or a coding, any way been involved in your literature review? Thanks.
Yeah, come to my session. I'll tell you more about it. No, I can walk through more of the methods, but the search terminology was similar to the first version. And yeah, I'd be happy to explain it more.
With a lot of expansions on upon the first version. Yes. Good. Okay, with that, thank you, Carol, for this overview and for the hard work on getting this database updated. And indeed, more information tomorrow, more discussion about it tomorrow in session 202, tomorrow afternoon. And if you want to volunteer to help coding, because you see how quickly this goes up, as Chris mentioned, then please do so. Then we now turn to Hai Dao and Johannes Vlakke, who were the supervisors of Guillaume Rohat. And Guillaume was a very talented young researcher in our field who sadly passed away quite suddenly 6 months after the original first scenarios forum, so on the 2nd of October 2019. And very interestingly, I've heard from many people in the community that they first learned about Guillaume in their role of reviewing his papers and how his work showed a very unique clarity and understanding of the scenarios framework and the history and the applications. And so many people were very impressed. And during the first scenarios forum, he was organizing and contributing to multiple sessions, very active there and clearly visible as an upcoming talent in the scenarios community. And everyone was really shocked when we learned about his sudden passing. And therefore, when from the community, and especially from Lena Reimann here in the room, came the initiative to have a memorial session for him during this scenarios forum, we saw it appropriate actually to do that here in the plenary and to commemorate him. And therefore his PhD supervisors, Hai Dao and Johannes Vlakke, have recorded a presentation for us that we'll now look at about his contributions to the literature.
Dear participants and organizers of the Scenarios Forum, we, Johannes Vlakke and Hai Dao, co-supervisors of Guillaume Roas' doctoral thesis, thank you for this opportunity to present a brief overview of Guillaume's contribution to the literature on SSP-RCP. Holder of a bachelor's degree in biology and ecology from the University of Lyon and the University of Leicester, Guillaume continued his studies at the University of Geneva with a master's degree in environmental sciences and a complementary certificate in geomatics. In 2016, he started a PhD in co-supervision at the University of Geneva and the University of Twente. During his PhD, he was awarded a very competitive Doc Mobility Fellowship from the Swiss National Science Foundation, which enabled him to spend 1 year in 2018-2019 as a visiting researcher at the National Center for Atmospheric Research in Boulder, Colorado, where he could develop case studies on the United States. We will present Guillaume's contribution to the literature on SSP-RCP based on his PhD work. The title of doctor was exceptionally awarded posthumously to Guillaume in spring 2020, thanks to the common agreement of the Universities of Geneva and Twente. Guillaume's main contribution to the literature on SSP-RCP is a profound exploration of the scenario matrix architecture with the development of spatially explicit case studies combining climate and socioeconomic scenarios to explore future heat stress risks at subnational and local scales. Black crosses in this figure indicate the SSP-RCP combinations that were explored in his doctoral thesis. Beyond the global, regional, and national scales so far addressed in SSP-RCP studies, Guillaume developed spatially explicit matrices for 3 case studies at subnational scale in Europe, at city scale in Africa, and at the intracity scale in Houston. Guillaume identified and reviewed about 180 SSP-RCP studies of future climate-related risks on public health, 28 of them dealing specifically with heat. The checkered patterns in these pie charts above show Guillaume's contributions to the body of studies in terms of spatial scales. In figure 8.1 on the left, where we see Europe, Houston, and African case studies, and drivers of heat-related vulnerability, figure 8.2 on the right, such as overweight prevalence of air conditioning, land use, race, ethnicity. All in all, aspects that are well beyond the population exposure addressed in other studies so far.
In the European case study, Guillaume combined SSPs with RCPs to provide spatially explicit projections of heat-related health risk in the year 2050 for 1,342 NUTS3 regions all across Europe. In this study, he could show that future heat-related health challenges are unevenly spread across Europe, with the Mediterranean region being the most and the Scandinavian region being the least impacted. He further showed that future heat-related health challenges are substantially influenced by varying levels of socioeconomic development, primarily through changes in social vulnerability. My personal favorite is this second case study, in which he explored future exposure to dangerous heat across 173 large African cities. He documented in this study that the aggregate exposure in African cities will increase by a multiple of 20 to 52 times by the year 2090, depending on the scenario. The most exposed cities are located in Western and Central Africa, although several Eastern African cities showed an increase of more than 2,000 times the current levels by 2090. In most cases, he found future exposure to be predominantly driven by changes in population or by concurrent changes in climate and population, while changes in climate alone were the exception.
The Greater Houston case study, for which Guillaume developed 4 specific so-called HSSPs, allowed him to understand that the effectiveness of heat-related adaptation strategies is highly dependent on the targeted aspect of heat stress risk, hazard, exposure, or vulnerability, the type of socioeconomic development, the level of climate change, and the place where the adaptation strategies are implemented. This type of infra-city models is a very promising tool to design effective policy measures for climate resilience, which more and more municipalities are committed to, as it is the case, for instance, today in the Geneva area. With the sudden death of Guillaume Roy on 2nd of October 2019 at the age of 28, we lost a brilliant researcher, a radiant personality appreciated by all. Guillaume Roy's work has already resulted in a dozen articles in high-level journals, presentations at conferences, as well as several awards. His research also resonated beyond the academic world, as shown by the press coverage of his article on projections of extreme heat waves in Africa. Humble, always smiling and helpful, this enthusiastic cyclist will remain for all of us an example of interdisciplinarity and high scientific standards. Guillaume Roy will continue to radiate in our minds and hearts. Thank you for your attention.
Yeah, then after commemorating the contributions of Guillaume to our community literature, we'll move on to put things in a bigger picture and a larger line of history with Tim Carter, who is research professor at the Finnish Environment Institute in Helsinki with over 40 years of experience in our community, actually, on the impacts of climate change, impacts and adaptation, and is a large propagator of the use of scenarios in impact and adaptation research. And in some of the recent European workshops, Tim has laid out the history of the climate scenario community scenarios very clearly, and that's what he will do for us today here as well.
Could the technical people please alter the font of the notes, please? Thank you very much. So, good morning, everybody. There's perhaps some ambiguity in being asked to offer a history of the scenarios process. Of course, there's always the suspicion that being requested to look backwards may simply be a commentary on one's abilities for looking forwards. But maybe there are some other perspectives as well to think about. It's been argued that to understand how the future may evolve, it's necessary first to understand how we arrived at the present. So this would suggest that to understand how the future, or foretelling the future, will evolve, we would need to understand how the past foretelling of the future evolved. And that, I suppose, is my assignment. But there's just one other thing before I begin, and it takes us back to 1968. There was a book written on the lessons of history, and it suggested that our knowledge of any past event is always incomplete, probably inaccurate, beclouded by ambivalent evidence, and biased histories, and perhaps distorted by one's own patriotic and religious partisanship. So you've been warned. So we can trace the use of global scenarios back to originally Cold War military strategy and other applications around the 1960s, 1970s, largely in relation to linkages being made between societal development and environmental assessment, as well as in other fields requiring long-term perspectives such as energy and, of course, climate change. And collectively, global scenarios have certainly been influential in raising awareness of unsustainable practices and of planetary limits that may be exceeded, and the need to deliver targets for, or to explore targets for avoiding these. It's exactly 50 years since this Club of Rome commissioned study, The Limits of Growth, appeared. That was one of the first examples of global modelling of societal and environmental systems, and it appeared 50 years ago now. Other examples of influential global exercises for environmental and sustainable development include those produced by the Global Scenarios Group, the Millennium Assessment, Ecosystem Assessment, which was published in 2003, and the UN Environment Programme's Global Environmental Outlook series, of which there have been 6. And note also that UNEP is also 50 years old this year, so 1972 was quite a key year for the environment. Energy systems, too, also demand planning over long time horizons. And the private sector has also recognized this, and many of you will be aware that, for example, Shell have produced prominent scenario exercises in the past. The International Energy Agency publishes regular world energy outlooks, and the Energy Modelling Forum has been publishing scenarios since the 1970s, so very long track record there as well. And then, of course, the need for global scenarios of future greenhouse gas emissions and their effects on the climate was recognised from the earliest assessments of the IPCC, and this is probably what I need to focus on a bit from now on. So here's a chronology of scenario development intended specifically for climate change analysis. The colour coding indicates 4 broad sets of scenarios. The first 3 sets were developed by the IPCC. In yellow, the SA90 scenario, emission scenarios were developed for the IPCC first assessment report. Then in 1992, in green on the table, they were replaced by the IS92 emissions scenarios, which were designed as reference scenarios from the lowest IS92C, which many regarded more as a mitigation type trajectory, through to the IS92F. And the spread of these scenarios was suitable for representing the range in the literature, but the central case, IS92A, tended to be used quite preferentially in a lot of climate analysis. These scenarios were evaluated in 1994, and a number of recommendations were made for developing future scenarios. One of these recommendations, out of these recommendations, new scenarios were approved in the year 2000 as the Special Report on Emission Scenarios, SRES, and that's the pale blue area on the table. These were rather innovative, these new scenarios. 4 narrative storylines describing different demographic and economic, technological and environmental developments were put in place. An open process was employed to encourage participants and feedback in scenario development. There was no central or best guess estimate, and no likelihoods were attached. A scenario database was established, and socioeconomic futures were clearly aligned with the emissions futures, and climate projections based on these emissions could be combined with the socioeconomic perspectives and projections, such as population and GDP, for use in impact assessment. In 2006, the IPCC decided not to commission new scenarios, but rather to allow for scenario development to be organised by the research community at large, with new literature to be assessed by the IPCC, which would also offer to catalyse the new scenarios process, for example, through organising expert meetings and such. It was widely accepted, in any case, that new scenarios would be required, reflecting new data on economics, emerging technologies, and land use change, for example. There are also new policy needs for mitigation scenarios, increased needs for socioeconomic scenarios to inform studies of human exposure, vulnerability, and adaptation, as well as a need for more refined global and regional climate projections. A feature of previous scenario development was that it was sequential, and inevitably there were time lags from the production of the emission scenarios at the top of the figure there through the development of estimation of radiative forcing of the atmosphere that was needed for climate modelling, through then to using the climate projections that needed to be generated in impact adaptation and vulnerability assessment. And typically this sequence took 10 years or more, as in the case of the SRES. So to address this, the members of the climate change research community undertook a fresh exercise to develop new scenarios by means of what was known as a parallel process. That's the pink area on the table. A set of concentration-based pathways representing the range of scenarios based from the literature, including ambitious mitigation scenarios, will be developed first, known as representative concentration pathways, or RCPs. For speed, these will be based mainly on existing scenarios and be detailed enough to serve as an input for global climate models. They were defined by their level of radiative forcing in 2100. So, for example, RCP 8.5 gave a radiative forcing of around 8.5 watts per metre squared relative to pre-industrial in 2100. However, it was recognised that the RCP levels of forcing, or any other levels for that matter, could equally have come about in principle due to alternative socioeconomic development assumptions and trajectories. And in light of this, it was decided to develop a small set of socioeconomic narratives separately from the illustrative RCPs, but then to quantify these in a range of different and innovative ways using integrated assessment models. 5 so-called shared socioeconomic pathways, SSPs, were proposed, and work on these took place in parallel to the use of the RCPs for climate modelling. Then the idea would be for the climate model projections to be integrated with the alternative socioeconomic scenarios for use in impacts, adaptation, and mitigation analysis. Uncertainties could then be explored flexibly across both climate futures and socioeconomic development pathways. It was also realised that in order to expedite the work on SSPs, there was a need to establish a facilitating and networking activity open to the entire research community and serving as a point of contact with external international climate change research organisations such as the IPCC. The International Committee on New Integrated Climate Change Assessment Scenarios, or ICONICS for short, emerged out of an ad hoc group of cross-working group IPCC authors and other scenario experts who had jointly developed the conceptual framing for the parallel process, and in a series of meetings and workshops, many of which were organised by IPCC. And I'm sure you'll hear more about ICONICS as the meeting proceeds. So these are the basic SSPs, organised according to challenges to mitigation and adaptation. And these were first published in 2014, and then they were elaborated in 2017. And some short excerpts of the 5 narratives can be seen, but I won't have time to go through them in this presentation. I'm sure many of you will know these anyway. The narratives are the foundation of the SSPs, which are built around a small set of externally derived quantitative projections of population, urbanisation, and GDP. This information was then input to global integrated assessment models, which were used to evaluate a set of detailed reference and baseline scenarios and an ever-expanding set of mitigation scenarios designed for different purposes. These cover a diverse set of variables such as energy supply and demand, greenhouse gas emissions, land use and land cover change, air pollutants and aerosols, mitigation costs and prices, and so on. Model outputs at country or large region level are stored in SSP databases here at IIASA. And there are now several of these, as you can see on the right-hand side. I probably even have missed some. I'm sure I'll be taken to task if I have. With new SSP narratives and quantifications in place, and with a new phase of the Coupled Model Intercomparison project, CMIP 6, being planned, this offered a new opportunity for more comprehensive assessment of climate drivers and responses that was available previously with the RCPs, basing these now, though, on the SSPs. Scenario MIP, as part of CMIP 6, provided a set of 9 new emissions and concentration scenarios using selected SSP quantifications, combined in most cases with illustrative mitigation pathways. As well as covering a range of forcings from the literature, 4 of these were designed to match the RCP forcings that were used previously, for comparison with the earlier CMIP 5 exercise, though these are not fully equivalent. Differences in radiative forcing and temperature outcomes are depicted on the figure from the Working Group 1 AR6. In order to make use of the SSP-based framework and to undertake assessments at regional or local scale, it's necessary to regionalise the global scenarios to the relevant scale of analysis, and then to select the appropriate number of scenarios. And we can use the scenarios matrix for that. You've already seen examples of this. Here we first show the range of global climate model estimates for warming from the IPCC AR5 in light pink and the AR6 in dark pink. And these global model outputs are points of departure for the regional downscaling exercises. The global narratives describing each of the SSPs can be extended and integrated to produce regional SSP-based socioeconomic narratives. Here, the SSPs are organised according to challenges for adaptation, the order from low to high, left to right. Each cell in the matrix also presents an opportunity to develop an integrated scenario of climate and socioeconomic development. Uncertainties in future risks attributable to climate can be estimated by comparing outcomes for scenario combinations down the columns for the same SSP world. Conversely, or similarly, uncertainties in risks attributable to differences in socioeconomic development and conditions can be estimated by comparing outcomes along the rows for the same projected climate. A key step is to make a selection from the large number of potential combinations. And the trade-off here is usually one of embracing important uncertainties whilst keeping the number of scenarios manageable. Another complication is that mid-century time horizons are often favoured for work with stakeholders at regional scale. In such a time frame, it's conceivable that the forcing assumed could be plausible over a greater number of SSPs. Here we've indicated 3 more with open circles that might be plausible in the 2050s, but others might argue that other boxes might become available as well. A final note in this context, and historians have that luxury with the benefit of hindsight, is that the designation of the new climate projections with an SSP prefix and a radiative forcing suffix, I would contend is potentially confusing on 2 counts. First, it implies that only the SSP forcing combinations simulated with climate models are valid to apply in risk assessment, like for the SRES, when in fact, the matrix architecture is designed precisely to explore alternative socioeconomic futures for the same future forcing and climate. Second, most of the forcing scenarios used for the CMIP6 scenario MIP simulations required mitigation in addition to the reference SSP to achieve the radiative forcing target, using the so-called illustrative mitigation pathways, IMPs for short. So might it be desirable actually to relabel the climate projections to acknowledge that? Another potential benefit of bringing in new features of socioeconomic development and land use change is that the SSP-based framework may also be used in other applications than climate change. This is because they often have very similar and common driving factors of change with uncertainties that analysts would like to represent. For example, SSPs were recently applied by the Intergovernmental Science Policy Platform on Biodiversity and Ecosystem Services, the IPBES, in their recent assessments. And scenarios with similar characteristics have been labelled scenario archetypes. And here's a comparison of the SSPs with the earlier SRES and some other global scenario exercises, some of which I mentioned and others maybe not, according to the archetypes defined by Detlef van Vuren and colleagues in 2012. So, the SSP framework is evolving, which is why we're here at IIASA. Whether it's converging towards the kind of scenario exercises presented in the limits of growth 50 years ago this year is an intriguing question to close on. One of the authors, Dennis Meadows, who was a frequent visitor here at IIASA in the earlier era, in a bygone age, was interviewed in February and asked about the difference between the limits to growth and the IPCC scenarios. And this is part of what he answered. There are profound differences between what we did and the modelling which has been carried out in support of the IPCC. I respect that effort enormously. But the nature of their analysis is just totally different from what we did. It wouldn't be too much of an exaggeration to say that the IPCC model starts first with what is politically acceptable and then tries to trace that in its scientific consequences. Whereas we looked at what was scientifically known and then tried to trace out its political consequences. The IPCC scenario is just telling us about climate change and does not get into other issues. We were trying to provide an overview, we were trying to provide an overall framework, so they're both useful efforts, just totally different. It's like picking up a hammer and picking up a paintbrush and asking which is better. And of course, the answer is each has its own purpose. But for now, with Bas looking nervously on, probably with a paintbrush in his hand, it's back to the future again. Thanks.
Thank you, Tim. That was a great painting of history there. And then for the last part of this plenary, we'll indeed move towards the future and see what, after this painting of this historic process, going into the Scenarios Forum, why we have these, and what the goals of our current meeting are. It's a slight deviation, of course, from the original program because Brian O'Neill cannot be with us, and we decided to merge our presentations into one. And I see that in doing so, I have not added him as an author to it, but still, he's well attributed. So, because indeed, following up on the, can someone click again so that I can use the clicker? Following up on the need of the request of the IPCC to the research community develop scenarios, and with that, then also the development of the first socioeconomic scenarios across the Working Group 2 and Working Group 3, the impacts and mitigation communities. In that process of development, there were a lot of meetings organized by the IPCC and IPCC workshops, but once the scenarios really emerged in the literature, we also realized that there was not a natural platform for this community and this very diverse community actually to meet. And that is why Brian took the initiative with Iconics to start a Scenarios Forum concept and organize the first one in 2019 at the University of Denver, where we had around 300 participants, 36 parallel sessions, and all crammed in 2.5 days. In the end, just 2 days and 1 hour in the second morning, or the third morning, because of the snowstorm. And this meeting at that point was presented by Iconics in partnership with the IEMC, WCRP, and the IPCC. And really the purpose of that meeting was to provide this platform for the very diverse communities that we also see here in this room now, that are using and developing scenarios in climate change and sustainability that would otherwise not have a natural home. The focus of that first meeting was very, or relatively strongly, on exchanging experiences with the SSP-RCP framework that had been operational for a few years at that point, to identify opportunities for synergies and collaboration and knowledge gaps for future research. So very much taking stock and see where the gaps are and how to move from there. And that meeting resulted, for one, in a synthesis paper, the O'Neill et al. Paper in Nature Climate Change from 2020, and in several other special issues. Many follow-up meetings came out of it. This figure showed a lot, actually, during that first Scenarios Forum, seeing what the first batch of applications of the SSPs was in the period up to 2018, 2019. You see here that it's basically still health between impacts and other related topics on the right. And in Carol's talk earlier, you see if you look at the past few years, it's almost 80-20 now. So this impacts part of this figure has grown quite a bit over the recent years. And based on this, based on the discussions at the forum and the assessment of the literature, then came 7 recommendations for how to move forward with the scenarios framework. So one was to improve the integration of societal and climate conditions, to improve the applicability to local and regional scales, and to enable or make the framework more able actually to be used for those purposes, to broaden out and not only focus on climate, but go beyond the climate research community, to look at broader reference scenarios. The original aim of SSP-RCPs was to create SSPs without any impacts of climate policy nor climate impacts, and then have these reproductions in the matrix of SSP-RCP combinations, it was realized that, that we need sort of a step in between more policy baselines, policy scenarios, impacts baseline scenarios. More perspectives and uncertainties in the framework, to bring those in, and yeah, definitely to keep the scenarios up to date. That need has been signaled for a long time, and to improve the relevance to users. Those were the 7 key recommendations coming out of the first scenarios forum, and where we left things about 3 years ago. Now moving forward, one COVID pandemic and all of us working from home for a few years, we meet again 3 years later, and we have grown. We have basically over 500 participants in this meeting, if we, not all here, but could have been all here if we had a larger venue. We do 45 parallel sessions over the next 3 days, and expanded the organizations behind what brings you this Scenarios Forum, still presented by Iconics, but now partnered with IMC, WCRP, the IPCC, and also Future Earth and Earth Systems Governance. The aim is basically still the same, to provide this platform for this community to meet. We don't have a reason yet to change for the second Scenarios Forum immediately the purpose of why we are doing this. And the goals are to convene, to bring together these communities, and really, because it's only the second time, we really emphasized and really wanted to meet in person, because this community is so young, and a lot of these linkages and building of relations between the different communities really needs to happen, and that needs time, and that needs just social interactions, because that's how we function as humans. Zoom doesn't work that well for that. Again, still to take stock of what the current state is of the SSP-RCP framework and applications, exchange our experiences. A bit more maybe than last time to reflect on the use of scenarios in the literature, where we stand, and whether they are used as they were meant to, whether there are things going in directions that we need to correct. To facilitate research, to identify knowledge gaps into the future, how we can go from here, facilitate assessment, discussions on how scenarios were used in the AR6 for the IPCC, and how they can play a role in AR7 and what can be done for that, and ultimately to inform policy and to make sure that the research base is sufficient to inform policy. And one special discussion, I think that's different from the last time. At that point in 2019, it was very much taking stock and where do we stand, how are these used, where do we go from here. Now we are at the point that we need to really start considering how we update and keep the SSP-RCP framework up to date. We have had an Iconics webinar on this topic in November last year. Many of you were there, and I hope many of you have actually also seen it afterwards, otherwise just catch up on it if you're into binging webinars. There is clearly a need to develop a process on how we update this framework of the SSPs and the RCPs and the quantifications, and this is a balancing act between providing, on the one hand, a stable community framework that can be used across communities and has some value in being used for both mitigation, impact research, and climate research, but at the same time needs to stay up to date. And so we need to really work on our versioning and have a joint understanding of what this versioning is and how to interpret that. And I see actually in Tim's talk already, there's from the first rounds, there seem to be misunderstandings emerging, where when the full matrix of the SSP-RCP combinations was for the purpose of climate modeling runs in scenario MIP was brought down to a handful of scenarios across the matrix, because the climate models cannot run the full combination. And that is then by the users starting to be interpreted as, these are combinations of these SSP-RCP combinations are the ones that are somehow better than the others. And if I go for a certain level of climate change, I need to have these socioeconomics with it, and a sort of implicit return to SRS times where socioeconomics and climate were linked rather than unlinked. And this basically emerges from how we have versioned and labeled them, and how maybe apparently something on the communication flew under the radar. Different aspects of the framework will require different update speeds. So we have quantitative drivers that are very quickly outdated. RCPs have they go into cycles of the CMIP exercises. Narratives and frameworks should hopefully be more stable, because we don't want to revise those all the time, but at the same time they need to stay up to date and relevant. And if they get really outdated, we should also acknowledge that and do our due diligence on updating them. So this will be throughout many of the sessions. This is what I expect to be one of the underlying discussions of where we go from here. It's also where we hope to see feedback from the session organizers on how they think, if we go forward in updating process, actually the topics in their session can contribute and should be picked up better in next incarnations of this framework. So, as outcomes of this meeting, we hope to see a more cohesive scenarios community. We hope to see more bonding, identify the scenario-related research priorities where we are now, the next steps in the SSP RCP scenarios process, where to take things from here, new ideas for scenarios across communities, and especially also, because that's one of the other highlights actually, is that at the same time there's other community scenario frameworks being developed, especially IPBES brought their scenarios, and that's also how these reconcile with the SSPs, is one of the other main discussions. And then as outputs, there are some ideas and plans for centrally organized output by the Scientific Steering Committee, maybe more authors as last time. A meeting report definitely will come out, and also potentially papers and synthesis papers. Your session feedback from all the session organizers is an essential point here. You find these session feedback forms in Connect in your session. And please fill those out, because that's essential for synthesizing the insights of this meeting, because there's too many parallel sessions for all of us to actually comprehend. Next to this organized output, also, many open initiatives are there. There's already special issues being posted in IIASA Connect for people to provide their papers to. There might be probably many more initiatives, many more papers, meetings and proposals coming out. So over the next 3 days, how will this work out in the program? We start today with scenarios in the IPCC, in AR6, AR7 after the coffee break, and community frameworks, how they work. Then we break out for the parallel sessions, partly here, partly in IIASA, again a reminder, and tonight have our posters. Tomorrow, when we start here, we'll focus on scenarios across scales. Hopefully, we'll focus on adaptation scenarios and the role of adaptation in scenarios, but we have a speaker with COVID who is at home, and so we'll have to see how that actually works in practice. And we'll focus on the scenario range and keeping that up to date. And then Wednesday, when we come back here for plenary, we'll have talks about policy baselines, bringing policy to politics, and integrated scenarios before we wrap up with insights and next steps after this scenarios forum. Next to this plenary program, all of you have proposed so many parallel sessions. We had an overwhelming amount of session proposals, and we really could not facilitate them all. We have 45 parallel sessions. This is the structuring as you see them in your program as well, across topics, right? Across scale, communication to users, Earth systems, ecological topics, impacts, mitigation, socioeconomic topics, and methodological topics. But alternatively, if we look at the recommendations coming out of the last scenarios forum and these 7 recommendations of how to move forward with the scenarios endeavor, you can also plot basically the sessions that we have here to these topics. And then you see how we pick up actually all of these 7 recommendations in different ways. We'll have strong focus basically on the integration of society and climate scenarios and the relevance of beyond climate also with the connections to other communities using scenarios, for other topics. We'll see a lot on that. There's a large cluster on bringing in other perspectives and uncertainties with completely different focused scenarios, low energy demand scenarios, post-growth scenarios, other visions on what scenarios could be. A whole series on keeping the scenarios up to date of related sessions there and plenary talks. Also improving the relevance for users. We have a lot of sessions now where it's about communicating them, using them by new user communities that work with scenarios, and how we can improve the scenarios for those purposes. And with that, I want to thank you for your attention in this opening plenary, and we have a coffee break.